Hello and welcome. I'm Keith Fox, and here we are at the end of Tuesday of the ESC Congress. It's been another hugely exciting day, and I'm with Steen Christensen and Martin Cowie, two key experts who are going to give us insights into some of the sessions today. And perhaps we can start with a huge study, really, PURE. So what has PURE told us, Steen?
PURE is, as you said, a very large epidemiological study going on in 18 countries all over the world.
135,000 people?
Yeah, about 130,000, I think, participants. And these two talks that we heard today, and also these are published actually in 3 papers in the Lancet, 2 in the main Lancet and 1 in Lancet Diabetes and Endocrinology. They were reporting on dietary, let's say, intake and outcome. And there were some very interesting, I think, take-home messages from these 2 big studies.
So observational studies.
Observational studies.
And food questionnaires.
Yes.
So with strengths and weaknesses within that.
Of course, some weaknesses with dietary questionnaires, I think there will always be, but it was validated questionnaires, and it's probably the best you can do in a study with 130,000, really.
Okay.
So they were linking this to outcome, and what they studied in particular was the intake of vegetables, fruits, and what the English call legume. I think this is something with peas.
In Denmark, what do you call legumes?
Well, I don't think we have a word for it. Yes. Yeah, beans maybe.
Beans,
yes.
okay.
So they were looking whether this had impact on outcome. And they found that intake of these 3 things, or either of them or a mixture of them, actually improved outcome. It decreased mortality, so it's healthy to eat this. But the disappointing thing maybe for cardiologists was that it didn't really affect cardiovascular outcome.
Yeah, so having adjusted for some key baseline factors, it didn't overall affect cardiovascular mortality.
That's right.
And they reckoned that for overall mortality, it was between sort of 3 and 4 portions.
Yes.
And another message for cardiologists, you've got to eat it raw.
That's
Is that right?
Because if you don't cook the vegetable and you eat it raw, there seems to be a better effect on mortality.
So maybe we need to keep learning from our Mediterranean colleagues about the diet.
Yeah, I think so, very much so. I think also for me it was probably not so surprising that it's a good idea to eat this. But again, still a little bit disappointing that it didn't affect cardiovascular outcome. And then, of course, one can speculate, then what does it actually affect? Is it an effect of cancer or infection or inflammation? And I think we need to, as we ask these questions, of course, also to the authors, and they will look more into this, and that will, of course, be very interesting.
Now, there was another component that dealt with carbohydrate and fat intake. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that was the other talk, and that was also very interesting, because a high carbohydrate intake was associated with a bad outcome, with a poor outcome in terms of increased mortality. But actually eating fat was associated with a better outcome.
But it depends on the fat.
Well, to some extent, yes. You know, of course, they looked also at whether this was saturated fat or it was unsaturated fat. And there was a trend that, for example, for polyunsaturated fatty acid, that was particularly good. But I would say also, as far as I understood, also a bit of saturated fat might not be quite as bad as we thought.
Yes. So the authors have concluded that we need a balance. Exactly. And maybe one of the things that we've got wrong in Western diet is the lack of balance in the diet.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
So let's come, Martin, to a very interesting study that you were chair of that session, a study based in Hong Kong.
Yes, I'm thinking more about digital technologies. So this was using a smartphone application to diagnose atrial fibrillation. And instead of having it in the hands of the doctors and the health system, it was given into the hand of volunteers. These are volunteers in Hong Kong, over the age of 50, went out to their communities, screened thousands and thousands of their citizens.
And it's a very smart device, isn't it? You just put your finger over the camera.
Oh, that's a different device.
Oh, that's
the
a different
Hong Kong
device.
study was using what's called a live core or cardio.
Okay.
So it's been around for a little bit of a while. But you're right, there are other technologies we might chat about. But they used the cardio device, they identified atrial fibrillation, they gave the information to the patients, they sent a report to the GP, and what fell down was the GPs didn't do anything with the information.
Oh my goodness.
They didn't anticoagulate the patient. So my question to them at the session was, why don't you train the volunteers to anticoagulate? Because they seem to be able to do things properly.
Bypass the GP.
Yes.
Well, you know, we've got real challenges because certainly in our country, and it may be similar in Denmark, our GPs are very risk averse and worried about people falling, about frailty, about bleeding. And many of the people at higher stroke risk receive no form of anticoagulation, and that is a serious concern and one that we have to address. So, Steen, let's come from this area to dust.
That's right, yes. In the session I chaired, there was a very interesting Japanese study. They looked at what they call air dust. And in Japan, as I understood it, occasionally they get a sandstorm from the deserts in China and other places sort of coming in. And then on these sand particles that come in, when it gets together with all the pollution that is in the air, this makes a sort of vehicle that brings in all this dust into the system of humans, one way or another, probably through the airways.
Yes.
And actually this was associated, when they had these episodes of dust storm, this was associated with an increase in the incidence of myocardial infarction, which I think is very interesting.
It's fascinating, and really one has to try and unravel the mechanism. Yeah. Is the mechanism associated with some of the microparticles? Is it some of the charged metallic particles, which may have an influence as well? And you know, I think that there's much more to be done, but a very elegant study, and one that couldn't be done any other way.
Right, and they also measured a lot of, let's say, content of the air on these particular, what kind of particles that were in the air. But I think this thing that it's a sort of vehicle that brings it in, the sand brings it in, I thought that was really a bit annoying.
So the take-home message is, watch which way the wind blows.
Yeah, I think so. You have to protect yourself a little bit, and I think that's what we also see, you know, when we go to Asia.
Okay. So Martin, let's come to Sweden from Hong Kong to Sweetheart. Because there have been some superb studies from Sweden.
Yeah, so over the years, many studies, and this particular study, registry-based, was the last 20 years of ST elevation MIs in Sweden. And it's shown considerable improvement from 1995 up to about 2006. And it seems to track very much with the use of PCI, the use of getting patients more quickly into centres, and also discharging them on statins, for example. So big changes, but then thereafter a bit of a plateau, I'm afraid. There doesn't seem to be much improvement in the past 10 years. And not clear why. Maybe that's because the nature of the individuals is changing. People mentioned diabetes is potentially increasing, hypertension has certainly increased. Or maybe it's the way we structure healthcare. Maybe we've got the flows very efficient. There's not much more we can do to speed up the time when you first get the pain to having your artery reopened. But fascinating work from such a national registry.
But it's not all about opening the artery. It's also about all the other components that contribute to death and to secondary prevention and to, indeed, to primary prevention, because, you know, maybe the cohorts are changing.
Yes.
What do you think?
Well, it was very interesting. I noticed, being a heart failure physician, that RALS, hearing RALS, was 37% of people in 1995 and only 7% in 2012.
So is that because RALs are not there, or we can't hear them?
Well, I asked the question. I said, is it because patients get there earlier, or is it because Swedish doctors are getting deaf, or they're not listening to the chest?
They're not using the stethoscope anymore, maybe.
Yes. They can't find the stethoscope. So it's interesting to see the trends over time.
Yes.
But I think it's a good news story.
But actually, being serious, there's been this important decline in cardiovascular mortality. There is a flattening out. And many people are concerned about the fact that the flattening out may also be associated with an increase, for example, in type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, indeed. And I think the nature of the disease we're dealing with, the comorbidities, is changing. Yeah. And I think we have to think of clever new ways of either changing the pathology or changing the way that we manage the complications of those things.
And Martin, thinking about lots of your expertise in heart failure, we're obviously getting more heart failure survivors.
Yes.
From the acute event.
Yes, indeed. And I think the infarcts are smaller.
Yes.
There's more non-ST elevation, but of course in non-ST you don't have the heart failure immediately, but quite often a high risk of developing it subsequently. So the practice is changing, and we need to keep up with that and find the best points to intervene to improve outcome.
Yes. Now, in the course of today, one of the hotlines in randomized trials was the REVEAL trial. I know you were both probably pretty busy during that time. But
that's right, but I think you know something about it, Keith, is that right?
Well, you know, cholesterol ester transport inhibitors have not had a good time. Studies have failed, or studies have been stopped because of an inadequate response. So here is a very large study with anacetrapib. And this study with 30,000 patients followed for a prolonged time. Now what's different is this not only raises HDL, but it actually lowers non-HDL cholesterol by about 18%. So if you plotted on the line of response between cholesterol change and outcome, where does this lie? It lies on the line with about a 9% reduction. So to me, and I think maybe to the commentators, this says it's about non-HDL cholesterol. And although it's an interesting result, I don't think that we have any proof that there is scope for HDL raising as a way of changing outcome. So
it always comes back to LDL, doesn't it? Non-HDL. Time and time again, this seems to be a very important factor. Or is it the size of the particles? But it's all about LDL. It's not
yes.
the HDL bit.
And it's even more complicated because we can't just measure LDL in the conventional way because it's confounded when there's you know, some changes in high changes in HDL.
Yeah.
So we've had some really exciting studies today. I think that what we've learned is we need to look not only at the randomized trials, but also at the observational data for the insights. And we need to get smart about digital health and the potential for us to improve outcomes. So thank you both. We've had a terrific day.
Thank you.
Thank you.